Well, we remember the book of Leviticus is to the Levites, and it's for them to know for themselves, but also to be able to teach the children of Israel. And the key is holiness to the Lord. And you shall be holy, for the Lord your God is holy. Now, last time we were in chapter 10, and it was really the first day of practical Leviting, being a priest. And remember, 2 of Aaron's sons were killed. And the Lord's commentary on that in chapter 10 was, 1, don't drink alcohol anymore. That was evidently a part of it. But he said the main thing is you have to be able to distinguish between what is holy and unholy, between what is unclean and clean, that you may also teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. And so we've hit a few times on our way in these first 10 chapters where it said, now if somebody's unclean, this is how you make them clean. And you're like, now, how did they get unclean to begin with? And I had to sort of say, wait, we're going to talk about that. And now we're there. So in the next 5 chapters, it's going to have how to be unclean, and if you're in an unclean situation, how to get clean. This chapter is about what you eat, what goes in your body through various kinds of food. And so in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1 through 8, now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the children of Israel, saying, there are animals which you may eat among all the animals on the earth, among the animals which divides the hoof, have cloven hoofs, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you may not eat among those who chew the cud and those who have cloven hoofs, and camels, because chews the cud, but it doesn't have a cloven hoofs. And he goes on in this way, and then he says, don't eat the hyrac, and don't eat camels, and don't eat swines, and he explains because either they chew the cud, but they don't have a cloven hoof, or vice versa, or they don't have either one. They don't chew the cud and they don't have a cloven hoof. And so, not to make it complicated and more difficult, he's not talking about an exhaustive list of all animals. He's just mentioning the animals they had around them at that time, right? But he is given enough information if you were to travel to Africa and see for the first time elephants and zebras and whatever, that you would have an ability to say, can we eat that or not, by these first 8 verses. So, a couple of things, one, this isn't a new idea. Oh, there's clean animals and unclean animals? No. It's always seemed to have been known from the beginning of time. Because Noah, remember, God told him something that he already knew. You're going to get 7 of the clean animals and 2 of the unclean animals on the ark. A lot of you guys remember that from Genesis? But a lot of people say, oh, he marched all the animals in 2 by 2. Well, the unclean animals he did. But the clean animals, there was an odd number, obviously, for sacrificing once the ark landed. But nevertheless, in Genesis 7:2, you shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, male and female, and 2 each of the animals that are unclean, male and his female. And in chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah built an ark of the Lord and took every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So again, there was an understanding. So in a way, in the practical way, why is God giving dietary laws at all, since they already sort of knew what was clean, what wasn't clean? Well, one is the dietary law gave the Israelites an opportunity to demonstrate obedience to God. So we are weird, aren't we? Humans are weird. If not, go watch a pride parade. No, don't watch it. But, it's just like, man, you wake up one day and you're like, I think I'm going to eat a worm. I'll give you a dime if you eat a worm. Remember that in school? I remember a kid one day ended up with 80 cents eating 8 worms. And I was just like, I've never wanted 80 cents that much, even when I was, 6 years old. Or there's a lizard. Oh, I just got to eat that lizard. Or sometimes people want to lick a frog's stomach and get high. I mean, so again, it is a law to say, if you think this thought or you have this impulse or you're really, really hungry and I'm going to obey God. That's just, I'm going to obey God and be hungry. I'm going to obey God and not do that impulse that I want to do or I've seen people from another nation do. And then secondly, the dietary laws separated the Israelites from the Gentiles and the pagan neighbors. So again, what they would eat or not eat would look different from the pagan world around them to this day. I mean, the other day they had somebody in one of the illegal migrants downtown, I believe it was Chicago, and it had on a spit a cat it was cooking to eat. Not something we typically do, but again, this is from his culture, it was not something unusual for him. So again, this did distinguish them from other peoples of the world, which was important. And thirdly, the dietary laws helped to protect the health of the Jewish people. It's interesting. From when Moses gave this law to the first century church, there wasn't a growth in knowledge of understanding disease and bacteria and all of that. All that's come about in the last couple of 100 years, hasn't it? And so if you were having a hard time and you're getting sick by what you're eating and you were to go and eat a kosher way the Jews did, you would be more healthy. And again, we look at the various plagues that have plagued mostly Europe, but other places where you had like the bubonic plague, which after the fact, hundreds of years later, they're like, oh, I think that was the rats. Well, again, as we're going to see tonight, man, if a rat touched anything in your house, it was unclean. You had to immediately clean it, wash it, and you're unclean until now. You can't even be around anybody. So if they were practicing this, it's like, why aren't the Jewish groups dying from this plague, And of course, unfortunately, the people, including the Christians, said they're the ones that caused it. They're trying to kill us all off, and that's why they're not dying. But in reality, it was their dietary laws. So these mammals, these land mammals, is what we start with. If it has a divided hoof or a cloven hoof, and chews the cud. Those are the 3 important things. A divided hoof or a cloven hoof or chewing the cud you may eat. Like a cow, right? You see a cow, it looks like it's standing still, but it's not. You go up next to that cow, it's chewing away because it's regurgitating the food. You're like, oh, there's no food around him. He's standing in the middle of the freeway there, or the middle of the road. What's he eating? What's he chewing on? Oh, he's chewing on the grass he ate yesterday. And then the other thing is, again, if it had a divided hoof, like a horse has a single hoof. It doesn't have a divided hoof like a cow. And it doesn't chew the cud. A horse chews the cud, but it doesn't have a divided hoof. Therefore, you can't eat it. You see how it works? So, and of course, there's a number of animals that have one of those, but not enough of those to be clean, like the same with a camel and so forth. And so he makes it clear that if you eat it or even touch the carcass of it, you are unclean. So a simple breakdown I have there. First, they must have completely divided hoofs. Basically, they must have 2 or more toes. Okay? That includes all of the bovine family, like sheep, goats, and the like. Secondly, it must chew the cud. These are animals tending to regurgitate their food and rechew it, and we know about that. And thirdly, Animals that met none or only one of the requirements were forbidden. So you had to observe it long enough to know that it had more than one of those things. And of course, if it's dead, around the dead, it's unclean. We'll talk about that a lot more. That's something that seems to come up over and over again. So now in verse 9 through 12, I know what you're thinking. This is getting riveting. You're on the edge of your seats. We're looking at the water animals now. And the bottom line is pretty much anything in the freshwater or saltwater, eat it away. Because most things have fins or scales. But if it didn't have fin and scales, then it's an abomination. You can't eat it. So you think of like sharks or whales or dolphins. They don't have skins and scales, right? Or shrimp, then it goes into those kind of creatures, the bottom type creatures like shrimp or crab or lobsters or clams or mussels or oysters. Now let me say most of these creatures can have some very serious diseases, and they hang on to their poop. And so if you don't really know what you're doing, you can get very sick. And if the temperature level drops very much at all, they can make anybody sick even after they've been cooked. So you got to be very careful. Interesting that the Roman culture and the Egyptian culture basically had the same dietary plan when it came to water animals. And all of these bottom-dwelling creatures are scavengers, and they do carry numerous parasites. So the bottom line is most fish are considered clean, except for those with no scales. And then the shellfish are also unclean. Now, verse 13 and 19 are types of birds. Now, this is interesting because all it is a list of 20 different types of birds. It does not mention how to determine whether a bird is clean or not clean. What we basically have here is 20 unclean birds not to eat. Why? Most of them that are on this list, like the ostrich, it eats its own ordure. You know what that is, right? Poop. But I like to help you guys get cultured. Or like the carrion vulture, it eats rotting dead things that are decaying. That's when it wants to eat it. Or the bat, because they carry rabies. Now again, if you've traveled at all, you may have eaten any one of these. I know being down in the Amazon rainforest in Peru, they didn't have really much refrigeration. If you had any electricity, it was just one bulb in your living room, that was it. But everything was salted, and they had all kinds of creatures, from monkeys to bats to all kinds of fish to dolphins. They actually have freshwater dolphins down there, little pink ones in the Amazon. But and of course, I know missionaries who are in the world today, like in New Guinea or in some of those islands around there, because they got those giant fruit bats. They're gigantic, and they are a delicacy. So pretty much when the missionaries are invited to a village or whatever, they will serve them bat. So if you're wondering, going, man, I just love bat. This is really harsh. God is such a hard God. This God of the Old Testament is so hard. I can't eat bats or vultures. Yeah, that's the law for the Jews, and it is for the Jews only, right? He says right there at the very beginning of verse 1, tell Moses and Aaron, Moses being the government, the civil government, Aaron being the priestly government, to tell the children of Israel. Made it very, very distinct and clear. Now, if some of you guys are worried about insects, here we go in verse 20 to 23. Now, just so you know, there's a big percentage of insects you can eat. So if you were worried about that. But he says the flying insects that creep on all fours shall be abominations to you. Now, I need to point off right at the beginning that this term, on all fours, is probably not literally talking about on four legs, because almost all creatures have 6 legs. But it's more talking about how it moves. It moves more like an animal that has 4 legs, like a dog, the way a dog walks or whatever. That's the way the insect moves, like something that has 4 legs. But yet again, most of them have 6 legs. They knew that at that time. Trust me, read Proverbs. I mean, Solomon's studying ants and ant farms and drawing parallels how to live a good life by how ants live. Believe me, they observed these things. They had a lot of time. They had no internet. They had lots of time to observe things like insects. But the bottom line is, you may eat every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have joint legs above their feet with which to creep on the earth. So that's like a grasshopper or locust or those kind of creatures. So, locusts, crickets, grasshoppers, they have the joint there above the knee, and those you can eat. And we have in the Bible, who ate locusts? John the Baptist. Now, I will tell you something. I looked at the word locust. It's found 24 times in the Bible. Here, it talks about it in a positive sense. And in the story of John the Baptist, it says he ate locusts, and of course, wild honey. You need honey if you're eating locusts. But outside of that, every mention of locusts in the Bible from the beginning to the end is horrible. It talks about destroying the land. It talks about God's judgment. And then we have these demonic-looking locusts in the book of Revelation. Nevertheless, here and with John the Baptist, there is a positive note on locusts. But the rest of it, it's you have locusts, you have something very negative going on. And then, of course, we've already touched on this many times in verse 24 to 28. Don't touch the dead. By these things you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. We've already talked about this earlier, didn't we? Whoever carries parts of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The carcass of any animal which divides the foot, but is not cloven hoofed and does not chew the cud is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean. So bottom line is, you see a dead animal, don't touch it. And of course, you say, well, that's common knowledge to us, because in our day and age, we understand bacteria and disease and so forth. But again, for a lot of people at this time, roadkill was, a great thing. I didn't have to kill it, and I still get to eat it. Whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals go on all fours, those unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and unclean until evening. It is unclean to you. So do you understand practically what this means? This meant that the dead rat was found in Israelite village. It would be carefully and promptly disposed of, and when disposing of it, would wash afterwards. Also, this practice would help prevent disease in a significant way. So if a rat just runs across the floor, or runs up on the cabinet, or gets in a bowl, or gets on some clothes, immediately the Jew would be freaking out. Everything is touching, it's making it unclean. I got to kill it right away and get rid of it and carry it out and dispose of it. And now everything it touched, we have to wash. And as we're going to go on and find, if it's a clay pot, it's got to be broken. If it's a metal pot, it's got to be boiled. Pretty much the way we would observe things today. And again, this would have protected them during the bubonic plague or the Black Death, killed 1/4 of the European population in the 1300s. But again, this is a ceremonial uncleanness. It's not a moral uncleanness. And I like the way it ends there. It says in verse 28, it is unclean to you. So if you were to argue, well, it just sort of came in, it got on my shirt just for a second. It got in the bowl, but it was in and out so quick. Forget it. And he's saying, whether you think it's unclean or not, God's calling it unclean. And whether you want to debate on it or not, it is unclean to you. And so as we go into the New Testament, obviously we're going to look at tonight, we don't have a dietary law and these kind of things. But God does teach us between what's unclean and clean, what's holy and unholy, right? I think of that in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 11, all the way through chapter 7, verse 1. O Corinthians, we have spoken openly to you. Our hearts are wide open. You are not restricted by us, but you are restricted by your own affections. Now, in return for the same, I speak as to children, you also be open. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? What part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has a temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them, walk among them. I will be their God. They shall be my people. Therefore come out from amongst them. Be separate, says the Lord. Now listen to the end of verse 17. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you. You shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. So how is this interpreted? 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and of the spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. So he doesn't say, chapter 11 on the kosher law, forget that. No, he says, guys, the principle remains. The God who wanted Israel to distinguish between clean and unclean, between holy and unholy, is the same God that wants that for us today. Now, Jesus made it clear, right? It's not what goes in the man that defiles the man, but it's what comes out of the heart. But nevertheless, what comes out of the heart can be clean or unclean, holy or unholy. Well, in Leviticus 11, verse 29 to 30 now, other creeping animals like vermin and reptiles, these also shall be unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, the large lizard after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the salamander. And you're like, oh man, I'm so glad I'm not a Jew. This is harsh. I almost titled it, something clever. Greg Laurie has this clever stuff, I was thinking of the title of the message, why we shouldn't eat lizards, or can we eat lizards? But the fact is none of this changes my diet whatsoever. And what these other people of other nations around there were doing was not healthy. This is for certain. Well, in verse 31 to 38, again, what if the dead carcass or an unclean animal touches you? And this is pretty much what we've been talking about. If it's on the wood or the cloth or the skin or the sack, you got to either destroy it or wash it. If it's on you, you're unclean till evening time. You got to separate yourself from everybody else. So again, if contamination's on you, it's not going to get on somebody else. Isn't that the way the fallen world is? It wasn't like, oh, by the way, if you eat this food, you become holy. It doesn't happen, does it? You can only be made unholy. A sick child can't touch a well child and get healed. It can only go the other way around, isn't it? Only the sick child can make the healthy child sick. In the same way, God is basically saying there's a lot of landmines in this world. And, there's a carcass. What did I just kick? Oh man, I didn't even see it. It was a dead rat or a dead mouse or a dead rabbit, or it's the head of a camel. That, oh, I'm unclean. I'm just sitting there enjoying my evening, and there comes a rat into the house and spoils everything. So this is what he's saying, is that there's a lot of things that can touch you, and there's things that you can touch. If it touches you, you're unclean. If you touch it, you're unclean. And therefore, again, you're unclean until you make things clean. So practically, again, these laws gave the Israelite household a reason to prevent pests, creeping things from coming into the house. No one wanted to destroy many earthenware vessels, cooking tools, or throw out a lot of food. So again, if they got to throw out the food, or they got to break another pot that just bought today because I had to break the other one because another rat got on it a couple days ago. Yeah, they're going to really be careful about what gets in their house, aren't they? They're going to be really careful how they live, the door being shut and so forth. Well, verse 39 to 40, an animal that was going to be eaten but dies before it's killed is now unclean. So, you got this cow that's a year old, and you're like, man, we're going to wait till the end of summer. We're going to kill that and have a big family feast. And you go out one morning and it's dead like a week before you were going to kill it. Can't eat it. Sorry. It's now unclean because it died naturally rather than by the butcher's knife. But again, in the pagan cultures, it's like, yeah, no big deal. It died for me. I don't have to kill it now. Let's cook it up. And this is the difference. And then in verse 41 to 43, emphatically creeping things are out. So he doubled down on the creeping things again. Creeps are out. Anything that creeps, it's out. It's not only out, it's an abomination. Don't have anything to do with the creeping things. And in verse 41 to 45, I am holy God, therefore stay away from that which is unclean. Let's read that. For I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourself. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourself with any of the creeping things that creep on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. So God is in essence saying here again, I uniquely, powerfully brought you out of Egypt, brought you out of slavery, taking you to the land of promise, and basically how you're going to be blessed there, how I'm going to remain your God there, how you're going to remain my people there, how you're going to be holy to me is your choice. I brought you out. That wasn't your choice. I did that out of my mighty hand. I came down there, told Moses to get down there. I forced the whole situation. I forced Pharaoh. I forced you. I forced Moses. I forced everything. I made it happen and got you out of Egypt. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of the story. Where we're heading, guys, the end of the story is that you find this happy place of being holy as I am holy. Not because I'm a prude, not because I'm legalistic, because that is where you are going to be physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually healthy. And when you're healthy in all parts of ways, that's going to really be the promised land. Right? I mean, we're going to learn later that they were in the promised land and they were captives. They were in the promised land and they were enslaved there. They were in the promised land and all kinds of horrible idolatrous things happened there. And this is what God is saying. It's not about just getting you out and getting you there. It's your regular choices while you're there. And again, Jesus made it clear to the Pharisees. God didn't put these things in here for you guys to write this extra laws, and so now, it's like you're so legalistic, you're so twisted up about the dietary laws. He said to the Pharisees, you strain at the gnat, but you swallow a camel. What is he meaning by that? He's saying you're missing it. You think by your meticulous keeping of the dietary laws that you're perfect before God, but I'm telling you, you're seeing how the gnat isn't contaminating you, but you're missing out on how you ate this giant unclean animal that is making you unholy. Well, the bottom line here is God is saying, I'm your God. And I have the right to tell you what to eat and what not to eat. And I would say the same for us, right? If God is our Lord, he can tell us what to eat and what not to eat. He can tell us what to do and what not to do. And again, Paul goes over this whole issue because in the New Testament church, when you went to pagan cities, there was no meat that wasn't sacrificed to an idol. I'm going to go into the swap meet area and I'm going to go get this barbecue chicken here. And it's called the Zeusomorphium, meat market. And you're like, wow, that's interesting. Oh yeah, we offer our meat up to Zeus. And this goes to support the temple, or this is who we worship, or have you ever been into a Thai restaurant or something and there's a big Buddha right there? Now, do you eat that? Do you eat there going, hey, they're worshiping, they're paganism, they're idolaters, I'm not going to eat here? Or do you eat there? Well, this is the point Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 8. And I, again, have a lot of scriptures printed out for you here tonight. But he basically says, we know there's only one God. So man, devils can say there's multiple gods. And this is a God we're worshiping. And Paul says, we know it's a big nothing burger. There is nothing. They can say Buddha or Allah or whatever, but it's a big nothing. It's a lie. There is no truth behind that. There isn't a Buddha out there that you're worshiping. There isn't an Allah out there that you're worshiping. There's only one God that really exists. And so, do I care? And Paul said, no, I don't care. But that's not the point of it. The point of it is, if you're just eating that burger and you're happy and everything's fine, but if the guy says, oh yeah, I love these burgers, it sort of bothers me the guy worships Zeus, but you want to eat there anyway. Now Paul says it's a conscience issue, not your conscience, but his conscience. He made it an issue. Therefore, you don't partake of it, to not stumble him. And Paul ends there in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 8, saying, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I'll never eat meat again, lest I make my brother stumble. Can you think of somebody who also did that? Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I mean, Daniel basically says there in chapter 2, he says, I don't know how you fix your meat. I don't know how you do your wine. I know you don't do anything with the vegetables or the water, so that's all we're going to eat is vegetables and water. Do you remember that story? But he wasn't even going to come close to defiling himself, and this is what he told the eunuch that oversaw them. And then, of course, in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23 to 33, again, Paul makes it clear, all things are lawful, but not all things edify. And then he makes it clear, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. So in verse 25 of 1 Corinthians 10, eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. But the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. And then he goes on to basically restate that you don't want to stumble your brother's conscience over your liberty. And then in Romans 14, verse 1 through 7, he says, receive one who is weak in the faith, not to disputes over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but the weak eat only vegetables. Let not him who eat despise him who does not eat, and let him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or fall. Indeed, he who made you to stand, for God is able to make you stand. No person esteems one day above another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats to the Lord. He who gives thanks, give God's thanks. He who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat and give God's thanks. For none of us lives to himself and dies to himself. And then in Romans 14:14, I know and am convinced by the Lord Jesus there is nothing unclean of itself. But to him who considers anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. So it really comes back to that conscience between you and God in the culture that you're in. And so he goes on in Romans 14:22-23, concluding, do you have faith? Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves, but he who doubts is condemned in what he eats, because he does not eat it from faith. For whatever is not from faith is sin. So Paul basically says that prideful, self-righteous attitude of the Pharisees about not eating this and not eating that could be the same prideful, arrogant attitude of a Christian going, I have no law, and I'll eat whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. He's saying they're the same exact ugly self-righteousness. Even though you're saying it's because I'm not under the law, but then have it to yourself. Shut your mouth. Why are you stumbling, people, over what you eat or what you don't eat? And so, again, in general rule, Harris says, it can be said that the laws protected Israel from bad diet, dangerous vermin, and communicable diseases. And of course, in Acts 10, it's funny there because Peter is prideful about keeping chapter 11 of Leviticus. And there he's hungry and he's in a trance and this sheet comes out of heaven. You guys remember this story? And what was on it? The unclean animals out of chapter 11 where God said, don't eat those things. But a voice, God's voice, came and said, eat it. And Peter scolds God. No, Lord. It's oxymoron. You can't say that, right? I have always kept myself clean, and I've never touched or ate anything unclean. And then 3 times, which was a very unique number for Peter and God. But the 3 times he says, what I say is clean is clean. Eat it. And while Peter was meditating on that, there's a knock at the door, and there's some Gentiles there saying, my master, a Gentile, Cornelius, wants you to come and visit him. And Peter walks in the door there in Acts chapter 10, verse 28 and 29. What's the first thing he says? I, as a Jew, have never entered the house of a Gentile ever. But the Lord spoke to me that what man considers unclean, God consider clean. And if he says it's clean, then it's clean. And of course, that whole concept of Gentiles being clean was an impossibility in Peter's Jewish mind. But yet, God is saying things that are unclean are become clean. So you say, okay, then we can eat whatever we want. You know, I still wouldn't eat those lizards or bats. I would have a tendency to just say, I think there's a good standard there, you know? I can tell you people that have gotten so messed up from eating mussels and clams and they have life diseases from eating some of those shellfish and just not the right temperature. I've had so many people go off to India and eat stuff off the streets and they permanently are sick. So I don't know. I think there's some real wisdom in there. Not doing it to be righteous or something, but just as a good standard. And of course, the issue came up in the council of Acts 15, where the guys are saying, Paul has to grab all these converted Pharisees by the ears, and they take them back to Jerusalem, and Peter and the gang are there, and Barnabas and Paul talk, and finally, he just says, you cannot ask the Gentiles to observe the law, the Mosaic law. And Peter says, yeah, you're right. Neither we nor our fathers could keep it. That's the one thing we learned about the law is we've all broken it. We've all touched unclean things. We probably have all ate unclean things. We've sinned. And it hasn't made us righteous, and it's never going to make us righteous, but we're righteous by the grace of God and faith in his name, Peter says. And then he said, but could you guys agree on just not eating things that are strangled or things that have blood in them still or whatever? And they all agree, yeah, okay, we'll do that. But then Paul, right after that, he says, nah, go for it. And Peter was eating it too because in Galatians, Paul had to scold him for acting kosher when the Jews were around and then become unkosher once they were gone. And of course, Colossians 2, I'm not going to read it all, but in verse 11 through 23, Paul gives this radical argument how all the law was fulfilled in Christ, and then Christ took the law and he nailed it to the cross with him. So the old covenant was nailed to the cross with Christ and it died. Isn't that what Paul says in Romans 7 about the law? It died. And if you wanted to marry another, Paul says, you couldn't unless the spouse died in Romans 7. So he says, guys, the spouse has died. You can marry Jesus now. You can now marry the new covenant because the old covenant is dead, taken out of the way. And this is what Colossians does. So Paul doubled down. In Colossians chapter 2 there in verse 16, he says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or festivals or new moons or Sabbaths. We're going to get into that in Deuteronomy and so forth. All these things were a shadow, he says in verse 17, but the substance of the Christ. So let no one cheat you of your reward. Taking delight in all of these legalistic things and super spiritual things. These guys are vainly puffed up in their own fleshly mind. But then he says in verse 21, we've died with Christ from the basic principles of this world. Do not subject yourself to regulations. Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. And then he makes it clear, none of these things help the Jews. None of these things are going to help you. There's no value against the indulgence of the flesh. Even if you obey them, you're not going to become more holy by them. Now you say, why is this an important issue for us today? Because in 1 Timothy 4, Paul said, I'm warning you, you guys who live in the last days, it seems crazy. I mean, I was just talking to Fred earlier. It's just insane to me where illegal aliens in California are going to get $150,000 for a house. But then they clarified yesterday, not if you're an illegal alien that's white. So if you're an illegal alien from Ukraine or Russia or some white place, it's only for people of color. And you're just like, tell me this is a bad nightmare. This is ridiculous. It's insane. But in the same way, these doctrines of demons, he said, the Spirit is expressly saying it's going to cause people to depart from the faith over lying hypocrisies. One of the main things is the abstaining from certain foods. And Paul said every creature of God is good. Nothing's to be refused. It's all been sanctified by God and by his word and through prayer. Well, there's a lot more I could say on that, but finishing up in Leviticus 11, verse 46 and 47, this is the law of the animals, of the birds, and every living creature that moves in the waters, and every creature that creeps on the earth, that to distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between the animal and that may be eaten, and the animal that may not be eaten. So what is it to be clean and unclean? I put the verses there in the conclusion of this chapter. I'm not going to read them, but in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21 to 22, Philippians 4, verse 8 and 9, Romans 12, 1 and 2. Ephesians 4, this is a great one, 17 through 24. And Romans 13, 14. In each of these passages, he basically says the sins of the flesh are unclean. The sins of lust, like the Gentiles who don't know God. The greed, the anger, the things, these are all things that are in the heart that become unclean. They're already unclean for the world who doesn't know God, but they can make us as believers live a life of uncleanness through walking in those sins that we have walked away from. And we all know that to be true. Well, chapter 11 was one of the longest chapters in Leviticus, but chapter 12 is one of the shortest chapters. And it's on the purification after giving birth. Why do I want to get through chapter 12 real quick in just 2 minutes? Because chapter 13 and 14 are, I think, some of the best chapters. Hold on. Leprosy. Yes, I don't want to take away from talking about leprosy. Such a great picture of being saved. But anyway, in chapter 12 is what happens when a woman gives birth. Soon as she gives birth, through the fluids in the blood, she becomes unclean. It's different for a male child and a female child. If it's a male child, she's unclean for 7 days. And then the child, right after that 7th day, on the 8th day, the child is circumcised. And we know about this, right? God made this with Abraham to be circumcised and all of his seed that would say that they are God's children. Now, just real quick, as I've heard people say a lot of foolish things about Leviticus, okay? I've heard people say, how can you believe in God? Let me read Leviticus chapter 12 or chapter 15, verse 10 or whatever. And it's like, dude, totally out of context. You have no idea what's really happening here. You're just pulling some obscure verse and making it sound crazy, and circumcision is one of them. Let me tell you, one of the remarks people will make all the time is, oh, a lot of people circumcise. There's a lot of cultures that circumcise. All at the beginning of time, people circumcise. That's true. That's true. But with God and Abraham, God said, here's this practice of circumcision, which, Abraham wasn't the first time he ever heard of it. I know a group of people over there, or a group of people over there, they circumcise their kids, and I've heard about that, and I've seen that, or whatever. But God said, this is the first time I'm going to spiritualize it. And it'll be the sign of a covenant between you and me. So it was very important in this sense. There's a great little book called None of These Diseases, and S.I. McMillan has a book. I read it years and years ago, but he basically takes the different angles of the laws out of Leviticus and said, what would be how healthy a person would be? And absolutely, you would be the most healthy person on earth if you followed the health guidelines that are found, especially for thousands of years when you didn't have modern science pointing out bacteria and finding penicillins and these things. And so circumcision, though, was an important covenant between God. Now, in the New Testament, and I've heard people say this, that, what's the New Testament circumcision? It's baptism. And they quote out of Colossians 2, verse 11 and 12, that says, in him you were circumcised with a circumcision made, how? Without hands, by putting off the body of sins in the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. So again, if you look at Romans 2 and Romans 7 and a lot of these, no. Baptism is not New Testament circumcision. What is New Testament circumcision? When the Holy Spirit comes into our lives, Romans 2 says it circumcises our hearts by the Spirit. Okay, that's an important point, because there are cults that basically say unless you're baptized in this way or by us or whatever, you're not really saved. So if you add it up in reading here in Leviticus chapter 12, the mother is ceremonially unclean additionally 33 days, a total of 40 days of impurity. Now, let me just tell you on a practical sense, I think these ladies loved it. You know what I mean? It's like, the mother-in-law's here to see you. Unclean, unclean. How many more days? Oh, we got another 30 days. I'm sure it was quite refreshing for these women. Now, the question is why is she unclean? The bottom line is because she brought a sinner into the world. That's the truth, isn't it? I mean, Psalms 51:5 makes it very clear. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin, what? My mother conceived me. So there is the issue of the blood and the fluids. We'll find it in other situations also makes you unclean. But why was she unclean for a total of 40 days? The 7 plus the 33, a total of 40 days. And why was she unclean at all? And we see that in verse 6 and 7, there had to be a burnt offering and a sin offering before she could be declared clean, because she brought a sinner into the world. Now, what's interesting, if it's a female baby, it's double the time. She's unclean for 14 days, a total of 66 days. And you go, wow, why is that? Well, the speculation again is, not only did she bring a sinner into the world, but she brought a sinner into the world that's going to make more sinners. This is a very important doctrine for our days, because all of the philosophies of the world today, especially the more modern, crazy ones, man is basically good. And environment, it's all about environment. And it's all about money, and it's all about good health care and good education. And if you get men, if you were to take this guy and raise him in an upscale neighborhood, an upscale school, he would, well, we know today in Beverly Hills, 80% of movie stars' kids are transgendered. So if you live in the richest place in the world, have the best education in the world, and you have a bad philosophy, you end up with a bunch of guys thinking they're girls and girls thinking they're guys. It's very sad. So my point is, this is the bedrock of Judeo-Christian ethic. This is why it makes sense. This is why our government makes sense, because they took it from the Bible with this notion. So we are born sinners, and guess what we do? We sin. We're not sinner. We don't sin and then become sinners. We're already sinners, and therefore we sin. And right from the womb, God says, we have the nature of sin. From the day we're born, we are separated spiritually from God until the unclean becomes clean, right? And he talks about here, I wish we had more time, that you bring a lamb and have a burnt offering, unless you're poor. And if you're poor, you can bring 2 turtle doves. And this is what we see in Luke chapter 2 with Jesus. He was brought the 8th day, and then he was brought after the 40 days in Luke chapter 2. And that's when she met Simeon and so forth, and the prophecies. But they were poor. They could only afford 2 turtle doves for the burnt offering and 2 young pigeons for the sin offering, which is interesting. Meyer said, "What a glimpse into our master's," referring to Jesus, humiliation. "He owned the cattle on 1,000 hills, yet he was so emptied himself that his parents were compelled to bring the poorest offering the law allowed. He stooped that we may rise. He emptied himself that we might be full, became poor that we might be made rich, was made human that we might be made divine. Powerful, powerful quote. And so the very end says, and so the priest shall declare her atonement and her impurity pure. She becomes clean. So, chapters 11 and 12. Dietary laws and the purification after birth.